Think about this. Thousands of years before we understood germ theory, before modern food safety regulations, before microbiology was even a concept, a detailed food code existed. It laid out in incredible detail which animals were safe to eat and which were not. So let's take a closer look at this ancient system. And that brings us to the central question of this whole thing. What exactly was this code? Was it purely a set of symbolic religious rules? Or could it be the world's oldest and most sophisticated food safety protocol? We're going to investigate this policy piece by piece, just as it's written in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, to see how it really works. Here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the code's own stated purpose. Then we'll dig into the specific laws for land animals, for sea creatures, and for things that fly. From there, we'll look at some really interesting rules about contact and contamination and wrap it all up with the absolute overarching prohibitions of the entire system. Okay, so before we get into any specific animals, we have to understand the why. What was this whole system of classification actually designed to achieve? According to the text itself, what was the main goal? Well, the text gives us a surprisingly clear mission statement. The whole point is to create a sharp distinction, an unambiguous system of separation. The goal is to draw a line in the sand, to make a very clear difference between what's permitted and what's not. So, let's see how that principle of distinction gets put into practice. For animals that live on land, the code doesn't just give a random list. No, it establishes a clear two-part biological test that every single animal has to pass to be considered clean. And here it is. This is the two-part test. A land animal is only considered clean if it has a completely split or cloven hoof and it chews the cud. It's not an either-or situation. Both conditions are absolutely mandatory. And this points to a very specific type of animal, a ruminant. So, the animals that pass this test are all herbivores with these complex, multi-chambered stomachs. This digestive process, what we call rumination, is amazing. It effectively acts like a biological filter, neutralizing plant toxins and lowering the animal's overall pathogen load. Now, where it gets really fascinating is seeing how the rule works to exclude an animal. The pig is the classic example. The text itself notes that it passes the first test, it's got a cloven hoof, but it fails the second because it doesn't chew the cud. One failure and it's out. Scientifically, this makes sense. Pigs are omnivores with a simple stomach, which makes them far more likely to carry parasites like trichinella that can be passed to humans. And you see this exact same logic applied again and again. The camel, for instance, chews the cud, so it passes that test. But it doesn't have a cloven hoof, so it fails. The hare is another interesting one. It appears to chew the cud, but it's actually practicing something called cacotrophy, re-ingesting its own fecal pellets. It's a biologically different process, and it fails the test. Okay, so that's a pretty consistent system for land animals, but what happens when we move into the water? Does that same kind of logical framework apply? Well, the answer is yes. For creatures in the seas and rivers, we get another clear two-part anatomical test. For aquatic life, the two mandatory traits are even simpler: fins and scales. To be considered clean, a creature from the water has to have both. Again, it's a strict and requirement. This very neatly isolates one specific category of aquatic life while excluding a whole lot of others. And the code is incredibly blunt about this. Failing this test effectively prohibits eating all the bottom feeders and filter feeders, things like shellfish, crabs, and lobsters. From a modern food safety perspective, this is a pretty smart move. These creatures are known to accumulate heavy metals, toxins, and bacteria from their environment, which makes them a much higher risk for foodborne illness. All right, so we've seen this consistent, logical two-part test for both land and water, but when we move to the third domain, the air, the whole methodology of the code does something really interesting. It changes. Instead of giving a general rule for what you can eat, the system completely flips. It shifts to a list of exclusion. The text doesn't define what makes a bird clean, it just explicitly lists all the birds that are unclean, and therefore forbidden. And when you look at this list, a clear pattern just jumps out at you. The prohibitions are almost entirely focused on birds of prey and scavengers. The animals at the top of their food chain, the ones that eat carrion, which makes them high-risk carriers for diseases and parasites. And the inclusion of the bat is fascinating. It's a mammal, of course, but it's classified here based on its mode of locomotion, flying. But wait a second. The sky isn't just for birds. What about insects? Well, the code actually has that covered, with its own unique and incredibly specific rule. So the default rule is basically total prohibition of all flying insects. But then a very specific anatomical exception gets carved out. If a flying insect has jointed legs that are specifically adapted for leaping, it's permitted. In practice, this allows for eating herbivores like locusts and grasshoppers, while forbidding all the insects that just crawl around, potentially coming into contact with filth and decay. Now, the logic of this whole system goes even further than just what you can eat. It also sets up a clear protocol for what to do about contamination, about what happens when an unclean animal's carcass touches an everyday object. And the procedure here shows this remarkable, almost prophetic understanding of microbiology. Think about it. A porous clay pot can absorb contaminants and bacteria, making it basically impossible to truly sterilize. So what's the rule? It must be destroyed. But a non-porous vessel made of wood or skin can be decontaminated just by washing it in water. That is a fundamental principle of modern hygiene, laid out thousands of years ago. Okay, so finally, on top of all these specific rules for different classes of animals, the code lays down a few foundational, absolute prohibitions that apply across the board. You can think of these as the ultimate rules of the entire system. The first one is a strict, total ban on eating carrion. And this applies even to animals that would otherwise be considered clean. If an animal died of natural causes or was killed by a predator, you can't eat it. It's at high risk of being diseased or contaminated. This is basically a cornerstone of safe meat handling. Don't eat what you didn't properly slaughter yourself. The second ultimate prohibition is maybe the most emphatic of all, an absolute ban on consuming blood. Now, the text gives its own rationale, that the life of the flesh is in the blood. But the practical scientific consequence of this rule is undeniable. Blood spoils incredibly quickly, and it's one of the primary ways that pathogens are transmitted. So, after we've analyzed this entire intricate system, what's the declared purpose? Well, the text itself states that these laws are there to make a people holy, to set them apart, to make them distinct from all other nations. These food laws are a primary tool for creating and maintaining that distinction every single day. And that leaves us with a final big question. While the stated goal might be religious distinction, the rules themselves form a stunningly effective strategy for public health and food safety. So, was this just an accidental byproduct of a symbolic system? Or is this ancient food code actually a sophisticated framework for survival, brilliantly encoded as divine law?